my name's Gary Ford, Managing Director of Tiger Hobbies Limited, UK hobby imports and distributors, and welcome to part 2. And in part 2 we shall look at the development of the aircraft carrier. With the destruction and damage to most of the US Navy's Pacific battleships, it soon became apparent that the aircraft carrier would become the prime capital ship in the vast Pacific. So we shall look at the rise of the aircraft carrier. Not long after the dawn of aviation in the early 1900s, aircraft were operating off water, and the navies of the world looked at these for spotting and reconnaissance. And soon ships called seaplane tenders started to arrive. These ships had some anchorage and large cranes to help load and unload these seaplanes. And behind me is a picture of the Royal Navy seaplane tender HMS Ark Royal in 1914, showing the cranes, the aircraft and the anchorage. As an interesting fact, the first Navy to use aircraft operating from a ship in a combat role were the Japanese in 1914 from their seaplane, the IJN Imperial Japanese seaplane tender Wakamaya. The United States Navy will be the first to launch an aircraft directly off a ship by taking off from a cruiser in 1910 by pilot Eugene Ely, and in 1911 Ely would be the first to land an aircraft on a ship when he landed on a flight deck on the back of the USS Pennsylvania. The Royal Navy in 1912 would be the first to launch an aircraft off a ship while the ship was underway. But it wasn't until 1917 that Commander Dunning landed on HMS Furious while underway at sea. The flight deck was on the bow, so the ship had to be going full pelt while Dunning flew up alongside and side-slipped onto the deck. This is a very dangerous manoeuvre. In fact, 5 days later, while trying the same manoeuvre, Dunning was tragically killed. HMS Furious was then taken back into port and fitted with a rear flight deck. This would make it maybe a little safer, but wind turbulence from the main ship's superstructure while the ship was underway would make landing on a ship very, very dangerous. HMS Furious did launch Sopwith Camels on combat operations during World War I, but these could not land back on HMS Furious, so they had to go and land further back in either Belgium or France. Not until 1918 that HMS Argus, a converted liner, became the first carrier to have a full-length flight deck. Too late for war service, it was used as a trial carrier to learn as much as possible about aircraft operations from aircraft carriers. From lessons learned from HMS Argus, HMS Eagle was launched in 1920, but had to spend 4 years on trials and took a number of modifications, including fitting of a starboard side island. It was actually meant to be fitted with port and starboard, but in the end they just fitted the starboard side island. And by 1924 she was commissioned, and the general layout is still seen on carriers today. In 1922 the Japanese launched the IJN Hosho, the world's first purpose-built aircraft carrier, not converted from a previous ship type. The Japanese, like the British and the USA, used this ship to trial aircraft and aircraft tactics and improve its use of aircraft carriers. The Japanese also got some help from a former Royal Naval Air Service and RAF officer called Major Rutland, who spent time in Japan advising the Imperial Japanese Navy on tactics and aircraft development. Known as Rutland, the hero of Jutland, was one of the British pioneers of aircraft at sea, thus had a lot of knowledge to pass on. Discharged from the RAF in 1924, he made his way to Japan. Remember, the UK had annulled its military alliance with Japan in 1923. In Japan, he worked for the Mitsubishi Corporation to help develop Navy aircraft, along with other UK specialists from companies such as Sopwith. He stayed in Japan until 1932 when he moved to Los Angeles, living in quite a palatial house, in fact paid for by the Japanese. In fact, while in Japan, he came to the attention of US naval intelligence. In the USA, they concluded that Rutland was working with Japanese military intelligence, passing intel over to his Japanese handler, a Japanese naval officer. The Japanese officer was arrested in June 1941 before Pearl Harbour, and Rutland was sent back to the UK to avoid scandal of a decorated former Royal Naval officer working as a spy. After the attack on Pearl Harbour, Rutland was interned until 1943, but remained under suspicion till his death in 1949. By the entry into World War II in December 1941, Japan had built its carrier force into one of the largest and most modern in the world, with a complement of some of the finest carrier-borne aircraft in service: the Zero fighter, the Kate torpedo bomber and the Val dive bomber. Japan had 6 large fleet carriers and a good number of light carriers. Just how much help they got from Rutland and other British specialists is still debated today. The US Navy got into the carrier game quite late, considering the pioneering work they did before World War I, and launched their first carrier, CV-1 USS Langley, in 1920. Langley, like the Argus, was a converted merchant ship and very basic, but again it did give the US Navy valuable lessons in carriers, workings and tactics. The designation CV, C, definitely comes from, we think, the word cruiser, and maybe the V from the word voler, to fly in French. But all US carriers since then are prefixed CV, and in 1925 the US Navy launched CV-2 USS Lexington, a ship starting out in 1916 as a massive battle cruiser, but was converted to a carrier in 1922 and commissioned in 1927. As the largest warship in the world, the USS Lexington and its sister ship CV-3 USS Saratoga were absolutely massive, 36,000 tons normal weight and 47,000 tons fully combat loaded, and almost 900 foot long. With an air component, 80 aircraft, the US Navy would learn all the tactics and leadership that would form the backbone of its carrier operations in World War II. Through their biplanes, the basic 3 carrier types were there: fighter, torpedo and dive bomber. Through the 1930s, the US Navy would start to build up its carrier forces, and the new carriers from CV-4 USS Ranger would be aircraft carriers built from the keel up and more effective. And these were the lessons learnt from CV-2 and CV-3. So by 1941, the US Navies would have the following carriers in service: CV-1 US Langley, now converted to a seaplane tender; CV-2 USS Lexington; CV-3, its sister ship, the USS Saratoga; CV-4, the USS Ranger, a new class of carrier; CV-5, the USS Yorktown, the carrier that would give us the later Essex-class carrier; CV-6 USS Enterprise, another Yorktown class; CV-7 USS Wasp, again a class on its own; and finally CV-8 the USS Hornet, another of the Yorktown class carriers. In the late 1930s, new aircraft were developed for the United States Navy after the lessons of the first 2 effective carriers, CV-2 and CV-3. And these aircraft would have to carry the US Navy through the battles of 1942 and into 1943, and in some cases like the Dauntless until 1945. And these aircraft were fighter, the F-4F Wildcat, the torpedo bomber, the TB Devastator, and finally one I've just mentioned, the dive bomber or scout bomber, the SBD Dauntless. In part 3, we'll look at the US Navy fighting back after Pearl Harbour and the early defeats of 1942, and we'll also introduce the United States Marine Corps.